Stephen Miller thought he could humiliate Jasmine Crockett on live TV, but then she calmly exposed the one thing he never wanted the world to know. It happened in less than 20 seconds. That's all it took for the entire debate and Stephen Miller's composure to collapse on national television. The cameras were rolling live from a studio in Tempe, Arizona. It was supposed to be a panel on immigration and national security, hosted by a mid-sized cable network trying to punch above its weight with big names. They got more than they bargained for. On one side, Stephen Miller, political firebrand and former senior advisor. On the other, Representative Jasmine Crockett, composed, direct, and never one to let anyone steamroll her. The tone had already been tense. Stephen had spent the first part of the segment lobbing sharp-edged jabs, accusing her of softness on border policy and destroying the American family. Jasmine didn't blink. She sat upright, listening. She didn't rush. She waited. And then she said it. "You want to talk about moral values, Stephen?" she asked, with the same tone someone uses to remind you left the stove on. "Maybe start with why your wife left you and took the kids 6 months ago." The studio went still. Not quiet. Still. Not even the cameramen moved. Stephen's face dropped, not in disbelief, but in something closer to embarrassment mixed with rage. For a half second, you could see the calculation behind his eyes, whether to laugh it off, deny it, pivot, or go nuclear. He chose the last option. "You arrogant, lying," he started, jabbing a finger in her direction, voice cracking. The moderators tried to interject, but he didn't stop. "That's a blatant personal attack. That is disgusting. You think this is funny? That's why no one takes you seriously." Jasmine didn't flinch. "You brought up families, Stephen. I just asked a question." The hosts were scrambling. One muttered, "We're going to break." But the producers clearly hadn't pulled the plug yet. At home, people were already screen recording. Some didn't even understand what had been said. They just saw the reaction and knew something serious had gone down. Then came the part that made it worse. Stephen stood up. Not fully. He pushed himself halfway out of his chair like he was about to storm off. A mic clipped to his collar caught the breath he took just before muttering, "You people are trash." That didn't go unnoticed. Jasmine blinked, tilted her head slightly, then just said, "Say that again, please." The moderator jumped in, voice cracked from stress, trying to shift attention to commercial, to anything. The producers finally did cut to break. Late, clumsy, too late to stop what had already gone live. And that was it. Within 5 minutes, the clip was everywhere. Phone screens lit up from Sacramento to Baltimore. Some people watched it twice before even forming an opinion. Others had already picked sides just from the screenshots. In less than an hour, it wasn't just a moment. It was a headline, a meme, a flashpoint. But that night, while many were either laughing, defending, or condemning, one question lingered in every conversation. How did Jasmine know? But if people thought that was the peak of the story, they had no idea what was still coming. When the broadcast cut to commercial, the tension didn't leave the room. It exploded behind the scenes. Inside the control room, everything was moving too fast. Pete Langston, the lead producer, slammed his headset onto the console. "What the hell just happened?" he barked. Not at anyone in particular, but loud enough that even the floor manager flinched. "We lost the feed 3 seconds too late," someone muttered from the back, eyes glued to a playback monitor. "It's already clipped and uploaded. Look, X is crawling with it." Stephen Miller had stormed off the stage and disappeared into the green room, slamming the door behind him. 2 interns were standing outside, frozen, unsure if they should knock or keep their distance. Jasmine, for her part, remained seated, calm, quiet, almost bored. She reached for her phone, sent a single text, and waited. Not a trace of panic on her face. In the studio hallway, Danica Bell, the network's senior producer, was arguing with the legal team over whether the broadcast had breached any standards. "She made a personal allegation," one attorney said. "We should have cut sooner." "She made a statement," Danica shot back. "He melted down on national television. That's not on us." Back in the control room, the team scrambled to adjust the next segment. Pete flipped through cue cards, muttering, "There's no way we're getting them back at the desk together, not after that." One of the assistants chimed in. "Should we bring in someone from the backup panel, Sid or that climate guy?" Pete shook his head. "No, we cut to the panel cold after the break. Get Miles to pivot the conversation. We need to cool the temperature, fast. In the green room, Stephen was pacing. Red in the face, he knocked over a chair and pointed at one of the assistants without looking. She's done, you hear me? Done. I want a full retraction and apology on air in the next segment, or I'm suing this entire network. The assistant didn't answer. He just walked out quietly and sent a text to Pete. Stephen threatening lawsuit. Wants retraction. Looks like he's about to pop a vessel. Meanwhile, Jasmine received a call. It was her aide, Nico. You okay? She smiled slightly. Never better. You hit harder than planned. She asked for it. I just handed her the receipt. You think he's going to walk out? I think he already did. Outside the building, a small crowd of college students and political junkies had gathered. Word had spread like wildfire. Something had happened live on air, and rumors were everywhere. Some said Stephen had punched a producer. Others said Jasmine had shown dominance during the break. None of it was true, yet. Inside, Pete and Danica had to make a decision. Bring Jasmine back, try to calm Stephen down, or move on without either of them. We can't reintroduce him after that, and she doesn't need cooling off, Pete muttered. Danica looked at the wall of monitors, showing all major networks. They're all covering it now. We don't have a segment anymore. We are the segment. Silence. Then Pete spoke again. We don't apologize. We keep going. Tell the anchors to reset. Keep it neutral. If we cave now, we look complicit. Back on set, the commercial break ended with a shaky return to camera. Miles, the anchor, tried to bring back focus. Welcome back. As you just saw, tensions ran high during our last segment. We'll be continuing with our political roundtable and addressing the broader questions that remain about values, public trust, and personal accountability in leadership. It was clean, professional, but everyone watching knew the real story had already played out. And everyone working behind those cameras knew the internet had already torn the lid off. But outside that studio, on screens across the country, something else had already begun, and it wasn't going to be easy to contain. Before the lights cooled in the studio, the internet had already taken over. The first clip hit X, formerly Twitter, just 89 seconds after the outburst. Posted by a college student in Mesa who had been screen recording the debate from his laptop, the video was only 15 seconds long. It ended right as Stephen Miller shoved his chair back and muttered those 5 words under his breath. You people are trash. The student captioned it. What did Stephen just say to her? It got 600,000 views in the first hour. By noon the next day, it had crossed 5 million. TikTok users were faster than cable news. Within minutes, edits were everywhere. Some looping Jasmine's line back to back, others adding dramatic music, news-style breakdowns, fake court gavel sounds, even a few with subtitles for the hearing impaired. One creator clipped just her facial expression and added text, "Me when my ex tries to act righteous after cheating on me 6 times." Another posted a mock ESPN-style verbal knockout graphic with Jasmine's face on it and Miller's score reading 0. Reddit lit up too. A thread titled "Jasmine Crockett just dragged Miller's skeletons live" hit the front page of ERSR's Politics within 10 minutes. Beneath it, over 4,000 comments debated what had really happened. One user wrote, "No way she says that unless she knew something. Someone close to him must have talked." Another, "I don't even like her, but this is the first time I've watched a political debate in full in years." That was real. Within an hour, old blog posts, court records, and even blurry photos of Stephen and his wife Kara started circulating. Most of it was vague, speculative, unconfirmed, but that didn't stop anyone from running with it. Some claimed there had been a quiet separation back in March. Others said Kara had already moved out last year and was living with her parents in Palm Desert. Still others said the kids had been withdrawn from private school in D.C. and enrolled in a public school under Kara's maiden name. Nothing was verified. It didn't matter. News anchors started referencing the clip, carefully choosing their words. One major outlet called it a rare moment of unscripted confrontation in a deeply polarized media landscape. Another went further, labeling it a public undressing of a man used to controlling the narrative. Meanwhile, on Instagram, Jasmine Crockett's follower count jumped by nearly 200,000 overnight. Her team issued a single statement through stories. Some truths don't need context. They just need daylight. Stephen Miller's team? Dead silent. Not a tweet. Not a denial. No comment. people noticed. That silence was louder than any press release, because if it wasn't true, why not say so? One voice note started making the rounds, a woman claiming to be Kara's friend, saying she'd seen the marriage fall apart firsthand. He never hit her, the woman said, but he made her feel invisible. He micromanaged every move, controlled what she posted, tracked her phone, said it was for safety, but it was all about power. The voice was never confirmed, but millions believed it anyway. Cable networks finally ran the clip, blurred in some parts, cut short in others, but even their cleaned-up versions couldn't soften the blow, especially since the raw footage was everywhere. No one could take it back. By the end of the night, every phone, tablet, and laptop in the country had access to the clip. Even people who had no idea who Jasmine Crockett or Stephen Miller were now had an opinion about both. The question was no longer what had happened. It was why she said it, and what else she knew. But behind all that noise, something quieter had started to shift, a whisper campaign that would soon take center stage. 3 days before the debate, a quiet message landed in Jasmine Crockett's inbox. It wasn't flashy, no subject line, no long intro, just a screenshot of an email thread and one sentence. You should know who's lecturing you about family values. She didn't reply, not immediately. The email thread was short, just 4 lines between 2 individuals with initials CD and RW. The last message read, "He hasn't seen the kids in 42 days, and not because of court orders. He just stopped showing up." Jasmine stared at the screen for a few minutes. She knew she wasn't supposed to touch it. She'd been in politics long enough to recognize a setup when she saw one, but something about it felt different, quiet, real. She forwarded it to Nico, her aide. His only reply, "Do we verify this or leave it alone?" She didn't answer right away. Meanwhile, in Washington, a few staffers in conservative circles were already whispering. At a steakhouse in Georgetown, 2 communications directors swapped theories over scotch and a $48 ribeye. "He's spiraling," one said. "Won't talk about it, but everyone knows she left. Took the kids, dog, everything. Said he came home one night and the closets were empty. Someone should warn him," the other replied. "If this thing breaks, it's going to be ugly." But no one did. And then, in a quiet restaurant booth in Santa Monica, a former employee of Stevens, an aide who left on bad terms, met with a reporter from a mid-tier political site. The reporter asked one question. "What do you know that hasn't been printed?" The aide leaned forward. The guy is obsessed with optics, always was. Spends hours on his suits, ties, even the way he holds his jaw on camera. But behind that, messy, real messy. The reporter asked, "Why hasn't his wife said anything?" "She signed an NDA when they got married," the aide replied. "Same as the nanny, standard in his circle, but she's finding ways around it." The reporter didn't run the story yet, but she made a few calls, one to Jasmine's office. Jasmine still hadn't responded to the original message, but she'd read it 6 times. Each time, something pulled at her, the hypocrisy of it all. Stephen had gone on air for weeks, spouting about family, structure, personal values. And here he was, possibly living the opposite. She called Nico the night before the debate. "I'm going to say it," she said flatly. "Say what?" "You know what?" He paused. "Do we have enough to back it?" "We have enough not to deny it." "Then it's your call. Just know. It's a hard door to close once it's open." She knew, and that was the thing. She didn't want to go personal. She hated that politics had turned into mudslinging theater, but there was a line, and she was done letting people like Stephen Miller stand on top of it with a microphone. This wasn't a cheap shot, she told herself. This was the only way someone like him would ever be forced to look in a mirror. At the same time, someone else was preparing too. Cara Delaney, Stephen's wife, had stayed quiet for months. She hadn't done interviews, hadn't posted anything except generic photos of food and flowers. But when word reached her, through a friend of a friend, that her name might be mentioned, she didn't panic. She just texted one sentence to a private contact. Let it happen. Because maybe, after all this time, the truth needed to breathe. But truth, once out, doesn't just float. It burns, and the next spark was already on the way. For months, Cara Delaney had stayed invisible by design. She wasn't a political spouse in the traditional sense. No campaign trails, no photo ops, no smiling behind podiums. In public, she barely existed. Even in old photos, she was often the one turned slightly away from the camera, as if her body already knew what her mouth couldn't say. But people who knew her, really knew her, had seen the change long before anyone else. Marissa Lang, her former college roommate and close friend, hadn't spoken to her in almost a year. Then, the morning after the debate, her phone buzzed. A text from Kara. No greeting, just a link to the clip, followed by, "I never thought someone would actually say it." Marissa called her immediately. Kara didn't pick up. Instead, she sent a second message. "I'm going to speak, but only on my terms." By noon, Kara had drafted a letter. Not for a blog, not for a tabloid. She wasn't chasing headlines. She wanted something quieter, something more honest. She sent it to Marissa and two other friends, along with her lawyer. They all asked the same thing. "Are you ready for what this will bring?" She was. The letter wasn't long, just under 800 words. No legal claims, no accusations, but it painted a picture that didn't need much interpretation. She wrote about control, how small things turned into rules, how Stephen dictated what outfits were camera safe, how she was asked to scrub her old social media accounts of anything that might conflict with the message. She wrote about silence, how every disagreement ended with him closing the door, sometimes for hours, how he rarely yelled but made her feel like noise. She wrote about the kids, how he had a calendar with approved interaction times, but would cancel last minute with no explanation. How they'd wait by the window for someone who stopped showing up. She didn't mention the night she left in detail, just a line. "I packed quietly, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking." She ended it simply. "I've been quiet to protect my children, but silence isn't always safety. Sometimes it's just a cage." It wasn't long before the letter leaked. At first, it was shared in activist circles, then picked up by mid-level reporters. They reached out to Kara for confirmation. She gave one reply. "Yes, those are my words." That was enough. By the end of the day, cable news anchors were quoting passages live. Some hosts treated it delicately, others more aggressively. One conservative pundit called it a betrayal wrapped in passive-aggressive poetry. Another said it was one of the most quietly devastating statements we've ever seen from a political spouse. Meanwhile, in a private hotel room in Scottsdale, Stephen watched the coverage alone. No aides, no calls, just silence. He read the letter 3 times. Not because he didn't understand it, he just couldn't believe she finally said it. Because deep down, he never thought she would. Kara, for her part, didn't go on a media tour. She didn't release a podcast or sit down with a morning show. She went back to her routine, school drop-offs, therapy sessions, walks through Papago Park. But wherever she went now, someone always recognized her. Most people didn't say anything. A few offered a small nod. One woman placed a hand gently on her shoulder at a grocery store and simply said, "You didn't imagine it." That stuck with her, because for years, she had wondered if she had. But now, with the truth circling every screen and headline, Kara wasn't the only one reflecting. Stephen was about to face a reckoning of his own, and not just from strangers. Before Kara Delaney became Kara Miller, she was someone entirely different. She taught comparative literature at Arizona State for 5 years. Soft-spoken, sharp-minded, always one step ahead of her students. She loved long walks, obscure documentaries, and weekends where no one expected her to smile on schedule. Then came Stephen. They met at a conference in Washington, an education summit, ironically. He was a keynote speaker. She was there on a panel about media literacy in high schools. He approached her afterward, impressed, he said, by her clarity of thought. At first, she thought he was joking. He wasn't. They started dating in secret. She didn't like his politics, but he had a charm in person that the cameras never caught. He'd bring her books he thought she'd like, text her random facts at 2 a.m., talk about growing up alone in a household that never really listened. He made her feel chosen, but that feeling didn't last. Once they got married, things began to shift. At first, it was small. A comment about her lipstick color being too loud. A suggestion to wear navy instead of red. Then came the requests to streamline her wardrobe, delete old tweets, skip public events if he couldn't control the press list. She told herself he was just careful, that being in his orbit meant sacrifices. But over time, control started to replace conversation. He rarely shouted. That would have been too messy, too obvious. Instead, he spoke in pauses, long, chilling silences that made her second-guess her tone, her words, her own memory. He'd say things like, "That's not what I said," when she brought up something he'd clearly said, or, "You're remembering this wrong." At night, he'd work until dawn, locked in his office with headphones in. When she knocked, just to ask if he was okay, he'd sigh like she'd interrupted a world summit. When their first child was born, she hoped things would change. They did. He scheduled his visits with the baby like appointments. If she was late bringing the baby into the living room for bonding time, he'd close the door again. One evening, their son, barely 3, asked why Daddy always looked angry. That was the moment something cracked. Still, Kara didn't leave right away. There was no clear abuse, no bruises, just a constant erasing of who she was. Like she'd been drawn in pencil, and he was slowly rubbing out the lines. It wasn't until he traveled to a speaking event in Boise that she acted. She packed 2 bags, took the kids, and left. No grand confrontation, no letters, just space. Stephen came home to silence. Her clothes gone, the drawers empty, the family photo removed from the hallway. At first, he thought it was a stunt, something temporary. He called. She didn't answer. He texted. She replied once, days later, with 3 words. "We need space." He didn't try again after that. Not seriously. His version of trying was sending a lawyer with a non-disclosure and an offer to revisit parenting arrangements. Kara declined. In public, Stephen never mentioned the split. His team scrubbed old references. They briefed journalists to stay focused on policy. For a while, it worked. Nobody looked too closely, until Jasmine Crockett said what no one else had. The night after Kara's letter circulated, 2 former aides reached out to reporters off record. One said, "We all knew. Everyone did. But nobody said a word. He ran that office like a vault." Another shared that Stephen had once demanded a team member wear neutral colors because her patterned blouse was visually chaotic. It wasn't about policy. It never had been. It was about control. And now he was losing it. But the real question wasn't just what Stephen had lost. It was whether Jasmine knew exactly what she was doing when she ripped the curtain back. And now she was about to speak for herself. 2 nights after the debate, Jasmine Crockett sat across from a local news anchor in Austin, Texas. The network wasn't national, not a flashy studio, just 2 chairs, a small crew, and a camera that had seen better years. That was on purpose. She didn't want glitz. She wanted space to speak plainly. "You've been quiet since the incident," the anchor began. "Some say what you said was personal, below the belt. Others say it was long overdue. What's your response?" Jasmine didn't blink. "I think the truth sits somewhere between those 2 points," she said, "and I'm okay with that." There was a pause. Then she continued, "Look, I don't take shots at people's families. That's not how I operate. But when a man stands on national television and lectures me about the sanctity of the American household while hiding the wreckage in his own, I'm not going to let that slide." The anchor leaned in. "So, you knew?" Jasmine didn't dodge. "I was informed. A few days prior. It wasn't from someone trying to smear him. It was someone trying to stop the gaslighting." That word, gaslighting, hung in the air for a moment. Deliberate, sharp. She adjusted in her seat and looked directly at the camera. Women, especially black women in public office, are constantly told to be composed, careful, inoffensive. Meanwhile, men get to shout, interrupt, condescend. And then when we push back, suddenly we're the problem. There was a quiet in the studio, the kind that comes when something lands the way it was meant to. The anchor shifted slightly. "Some of your critics say you weaponized personal pain, that you should have stuck to policy." Jasmine laughed, just once, not out of amusement, more disbelief. Stephen Miller built his brand on personal attacks. Look at his history. He didn't care about policy. He cared about posturing, about feeding his followers red meat. "I didn't weaponize anything. I held up a mirror." That mirror, she admitted, cost her. 2 sponsors for her upcoming town halls pulled back. One donor postponed a scheduled fundraiser. She received over a dozen threats in her inbox, some graphic. Her staff added security protocols, but something else happened too. Her voter engagement site crashed from the sudden spike in traffic. Her team had to add 2 more staffers to handle messages from women, mothers, daughters, teachers, thanking her, not for the drama, but for the honesty. Jasmine shared one message that stuck with her. A woman in Arkansas wrote, "I left a man like that 12 years ago. Nobody believed me until I stopped explaining and just walked away. Thank you for not backing down." She paused during the interview, then quietly added, "There are thousands of women walking around with stories like that. Sometimes all it takes is one person breaking the silence to remind them they're not alone." Was she worried about political fallout? A little, but she was more tired of swallowing truth to make men comfortable. She hadn't planned the moment at the debate down to the word. It wasn't scripted, but it wasn't random either. It had built up over months, watching men like Stephen spout family values while their own lives told a different story. She didn't enjoy saying it, but she didn't regret it either. "I didn't go in looking to cut," she said toward the end of the interview. "I went in ready to stop bleeding." Outside the studio, her team waited beside a black SUV. Nico was holding his phone, showing her the latest clip that had gone viral, her face calm, overlaid with the quote, "Sometimes truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone brave enough to say it." She raised an eyebrow. "Did I say that?" Nico grinned. "Nope, but they think you did." She chuckled. "Let them run with it." Then she got in the car. But while Jasmine was moving forward, the storm around Stephen was far from over. And next, it would spread beyond him to the very people who built him up. The backlash came quickly, and not just from Stephen Miller. Within 24 hours of Jasmine's interview, conservative media circled the wagons. Headlines flared like warning signals. Crockett crosses the line. When personal attacks replaced policy, dangerous precedent set by out-of-control left. On one primetime show, a former senator said, "This wasn't political courage. This was a character assassination live on air. If we let this kind of behavior slide, the entire foundation of civil discourse crumbles." He didn't mention Stephen's behavior, neither did the others. Every talking head seemed to be reading from the same page, condemn her, deflect from him. Some even tried to turn Stephen into the victim. "His family life should be off limits," one panelist argued. "He's a private citizen now." But that argument didn't land the way it used to. People remembered his policies, his language, the way he'd gone after others publicly for years. And now, the same man who once suggested immigrant children were a burden to the nation was suddenly asking for privacy. It didn't sit right. Even some on the right said so, quietly. One conservative columnist from Phoenix wrote, "If Stephen wanted to keep his personal life personal, he probably shouldn't have built his brand on attacking other people's families." But Stephen wasn't going down alone. His allies flooded the airwaves and internet, defending his record, attacking Jasmine's tone, even spreading rumors that her team had paid someone off for the information. There was no proof. Still, the narrative gained traction in some corners. A few local stations ran with it. "Who really leaked the story?" one anchor asked. "And was this premeditated slander?" Jasmine's office released a simple statement. "We made no payments to anyone. We don't need to." But behind the scenes, things were unraveling. Stephen canceled 2 planned speaking events, one in Tampa, one in Las Vegas. His name disappeared from a fundraiser flyer just days before the event. Organizers said it was a scheduling conflict, but donors whispered otherwise. His own PR team started hesitating. One insider claimed he refused to follow their advice. "He wants to go nuclear," the source said, "but we're telling him, this isn't 2016. That playbook's worn out." He refused to issue a statement about Kara's letter, told staff to let it die. But it didn't die. It multiplied. Podcasts picked it up. Late-night hosts mocked him. Even comedians who rarely touched politics started joking about the guy who got publicly divorced during a budget debate. Then came the polls. One conservative think tank quietly ran a focus group. Older voters, mixed demographics, mostly suburban. The result? Jasmine's favorability went up. Stephen's? Down, sharply. Not because of the divorce itself, but because of how he handled it. The anger, the silence, the way he blamed everyone except himself. It was the first time some of his longtime backers started pulling away. "I'm done defending this guy," one strategist said off camera. "He made his bed. Now he's just mad it's cold." Even Kara noticed. That week, she filed for sole custody in Maricopa County. No press release, No dramatic headlines, just a quiet filing that sent a loud message. And still, Stephen said nothing publicly. That silence, once a tactic, was now a symptom. Jasmine, meanwhile, went about her business, met with constituents, voted on education reform, attended a housing summit in Dallas. She didn't gloat, didn't mention his name again. She didn't have to, because everyone else still was. But if Stephen thought staying quiet would make it stop, he hadn't learned the one truth he never saw coming. Sometimes silence only gives the story more room to grow. Stephen Miller had always believed he could outlast any controversy. He'd done it before, countless times. The media storm would blow over, and the next outrage would take its place. That was the cycle. Survive long enough, and people forget. But this time, it stuck. For a full week, he went dark. No appearances, no interviews, no statements. The man who once filled cable news slots like clockwork was suddenly nowhere to be found. Then came the Scottsdale photo. It wasn't anything dramatic, just a grainy image taken by a server at a high-end resort. Stephen, sitting alone at the edge of an outdoor dining area. No phone, no book, just staring out across a dry Arizona golf course. He looked tired. The photo spread fast, not because it was scandalous, but because it looked so different from the image he'd spent years cultivating. Man looks like he aged 10 years overnight, one comment read. Another, this is what happens when the mask slips. Kara didn't say a word. She didn't need to. 3 days later, her lawyer filed for sole custody, citing emotional neglect, controlling behavior, and the inability of the father to maintain consistent, safe communication with the children. The filing was calm, professional, brutal in its clarity. Still, Stephen made no move to respond publicly, not even to the court. The silence wasn't strategic anymore, it was resignation. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett received a package at her DC office. No return address. Just a printed copy of Kara's letter folded inside a blank card. Handwritten at the bottom in clean cursive. Thank you for not letting it slide. Jasmine didn't frame it. She didn't show it to the press. She tucked it in the side pocket of her leather work bag and carried on with her day. That same week, something unexpected happened. 2 women, former aides to prominent conservative figures, reached out to a journalist covering the story. They shared similar experiences of being silenced, minimized, pushed out quietly when they raised concerns about the behavior of powerful men. Their stories weren't about Stephen specifically, but his fall opened a door. The stories were published as a series titled Behind the Podium. They didn't go viral, but they got read, and for the women who shared them, that was enough. Somewhere in Los Angeles, a mid-tier campaign consultant sat down for an interview and said, "It's not about taking men down, it's about making sure they stop pretending they're untouchable." That sentence echoed across smaller circles. Community organizers quoted it. College debate teams dissected it. It showed up in a professor's syllabus. Back in Arizona, Kara made her first public appearance since the letter. It wasn't a press event or a media tour. She attended a local PTA meeting in Mesa, just a mother with questions about the school's reading list. A few parents recognized her. One of them, a younger mom, approached afterward and asked, "Are you really her?" Kara smiled. "I'm just here for the books." And she meant it. Stephen, for all his fury, never did return to regular television. His podcast lost 2 sponsors. He was dropped from an upcoming documentary project. He didn't disappear entirely, but he shrank. His name became a cautionary tale in media training sessions. A lesson in how not to lose your public image by forgetting who's actually watching. As for Jasmine, she never brought up his name again. Not in speeches, not in interviews, not in passing, because she didn't have to. She'd said what she needed to say. The rest of the country had already filled in the blanks. But even as the dust started to settle, one question remained, not about Stephen or even Jasmine, but about the people watching from the sidelines, wondering what they would have done in her place. Weeks passed. The headlines faded. New controversies filled the news cycle. The moment between Jasmine Crockett and Stephen Miller became less of a flashpoint and more of a reference, an example of how quickly truth can crack through a polished shell. But for the people who had watched it live, it left something behind. Not just drama, not just shock, something deeper. For some, it was the first time they'd seen a public figure call out hypocrisy without blinking. No disclaimers, no polished apology after the fact, Just honesty, straight and sharp. For others, it was a reminder that even the loudest voices on TV, the ones shouting about values, families, and morality, might be hiding the most behind closed doors. And then there were those who saw themselves in it. Not in the politics, but in the experience. People who'd been silenced by partners who controlled every part of their life except their spirit. People who had been told to keep it classy when someone mistreated them. People who had finally walked away quietly and waited years for someone to say out loud what they couldn't. That was the ripple Jasmine never planned but created anyway. And maybe that was the lesson. Sometimes speaking up doesn't come with applause. Sometimes it comes with threats, judgment, and loss. But still, if it speaks for the people who've been spoken over, maybe it's worth it. Jasmine didn't ride the wave. She let it pass. She returned to committee work, helped push through a local infrastructure bill, and focused on the district that elected her, not the headlines that tried to define her. In a radio interview later that month, when asked how she felt about the whole ordeal, she simply said, "I didn't do it to go viral. I did it because I got tired of letting silence win." She didn't elaborate. Because when you tell the truth and live to see the echo, you don't always have to repeat yourself. Stephen, somewhere far from the camera lens, stayed quiet, maybe for good. Kara, now legally separated, enrolled in a master's program and volunteered at a women's advocacy center in Tempe. She never mentioned Stephen's name again, not to reporters, not to friends, not even when asked directly. It wasn't bitterness, just clarity. And across the country, in small towns and big cities, that moment on live television lived on in whispers, in group chats, in women's shelters, in classrooms, in office conversations that started with, "Did you see what happened?" but ended with, "Yeah, I know how that feels." Because the truth is, power doesn't always fall with a crash. Sometimes it loses its grip in silence, when the people it used to control start saying, "Enough." So what now? Maybe it's not about winning arguments on live TV. Maybe it's about knowing when someone's righteousness is just a mask, and being brave enough to pull it off, not out of revenge, but so others can stop pretending. That's the thing about truth. It doesn't always sound pretty. It doesn't always come with a bow. But when it's real, it doesn't go back into hiding, and neither do the people who speak it. If this story made you think about power, control, and the weight of silence, don't let it stop here. Speak up. Ask questions. Listen when others finally do. And if you haven't already, subscribe. There are more stories that matter, and we're just getting started.